Welcome to World of Sleepcraft, where the rich lore of Azeroth becomes your gateway to peaceful rest. Tonight, we journey through the life of Uther the Lightbringer, the first paladin and founder of the Knights of the Silver Hand. His story spans the birth of a sacred order, the tragedy of a beloved student's fall, and a journey through death itself into the realms beyond. Settle in, get comfortable, and let this tale of honor, sacrifice, and redemption unfold before you. Let your breathing slow and your thoughts drift as we explore the life of one of Azeroth's greatest heroes. From humble beginnings in the kingdom of Lordaeron to his final rest in the Shadowlands, Uther's story illuminates the highest ideals of the light and the weight of choices made in impossible circumstances. Long before the orcs came through the dark portal, long before the wars that would reshape the world, the kingdom of Lordaeron stood as one of humanity's greatest achievements. Its cities gleamed, white in the northern sun, their towers reaching toward the heavens as if in prayer. Its farms produced abundant harvests that fed not just the kingdom itself, but trade partners throughout the eastern kingdoms. Its people lived in relative peace under the guidance of the Church of the Holy Light, their days marked by the rhythm of worship and work. The capital city of Lordaeron was the heart of this kingdom, a sprawling metropolis that represented the pinnacle of human civilization. Great walls surrounded it, built by generations of masons and blessed by countless priests. Within those walls, markets bustled with activity, craftsmen produced goods of remarkable quality, and scholars debated philosophy in the shade of ancient trees. The royal palace stood at the city's center, home to the Menethil dynasty that had ruled Lordaeron for generations. It was in this golden age that a young man named Uther first felt the calling of something greater than himself. The exact circumstances of his awakening to the light have been the subject of much speculation over the years. Some say he experienced a vision during a particularly intense prayer service. Others claim that he simply knew from his earliest memories that he was meant to serve something beyond mortal concerns. The truth has been lost to time, but the result is certain. Uther dedicated himself to the light with a fervor that would define his entire existence. The exact details of Uther's early life have been lost to history, worn away by time and the cataclysms that would later devastate the lands where he was born. What we know is that he came from Lordaeron, that he was raised in the traditions of the light, and that from an early age he demonstrated both martial prowess and spiritual devotion. These twin gifts would come to define his entire existence. The Church of the Holy Light was the dominant spiritual force in human society during this era. Its teachings emphasized three virtues, above all others: respect, tenacity, and compassion. Respect for the universe and the interconnected nature of all things. Tenacity in pursuing what is right, no matter how difficult the path. And compassion for all beings, even those who have fallen into darkness. These virtues would become the foundation of everything Uther believed and everything he would later teach. The church operated through a hierarchy of priests and bishops, with the archbishop at its head. During Uther's formative years, the archbishop was a wise and visionary man named Faol. He led the Holy Order of Northshire Clerics, a brotherhood of healing priests who served the kingdom of Azeroth to the south. The Northshire Clerics had established their abbey in the peaceful valley of Northshire, a secluded place of learning and devotion where those called to the light could dedicate themselves fully to its service. The abbey itself was a marvel of human architecture and faith. Its spires reached toward the heavens, and its gardens bloomed with flowers that seemed to glow with an inner radiance. Within its walls, priests studied ancient texts, practiced healing arts, and contemplated the mysteries of the light. The sound of hymns echoed through its corridors at all hours, a constant reminder of the devotion that bound the brothers together. Faol recognized something special in the young Uther, a combination of faith and strength that was rare even among the most devoted followers of the light. The Archbishop had seen many promising students over his long years of service, but few had demonstrated Uther's particular blend of qualities. Most who excelled at martial training lacked spiritual depth, while those who showed great spiritual potential often proved unsuited for physical combat. Uther seemed to possess both in equal measure. Under Faol's guidance, Uther began his training in the ways of the light. He learned the prayers and meditations that allowed one to channel the light's power. He studied the holy texts and philosophical treatises that formed the basis of the Church's teachings, and he practiced the martial skills that were expected of a knight of Lordaeron, for even in times of peace, the kingdom maintained warriors who could defend it if the need arose. The training in meditation was particularly demanding. Uther would spend hours in the abbey's meditation chambers, small stone rooms lit only by a single candle. He learned to quiet his mind, to silence the constant chatter of thoughts that distracted from true communion with the light. At first, this stillness seemed impossible. His body ached to move, his mind raced with plans and worries, and the silence pressed in on him like a physical weight. But gradually, through persistence and guidance, Uther learned to find the stillness within himself. He discovered that the light was not something external that had to be summoned or called. It was always present, flowing through all living things, waiting to be recognized and channeled. The meditation practices taught him to open himself to this presence, to become a vessel through which the light could flow into the world. The Abbey's library became Uther's second home during these years of training. Dusty tomes lined the walls from floor to ceiling, containing the accumulated wisdom of centuries of theological thought. He read the writings of ancient philosophers who had first codified the tenets of the light. He studied the accounts of saints and martyrs who had demonstrated the light's power through miraculous deeds. He absorbed the commentaries and interpretations that scholars had developed over generations, learning to understand the nuances of faith. The three virtues of the light were not merely concepts to memorize, but principles to be lived. Respect required Uther to see the divine spark in every being he encountered, from the highest noble to the lowest beggar. Tenacity demanded that he pursue what was right even when the path was difficult, even when easier alternatives beckoned. Compassion insisted that he always consider the needs of others, that he extend mercy even to those who might not seem to deserve it. Physical training complemented the spiritual education. Uther learned swordsmanship from the knights who protected the abbey, spending hours practicing strikes and parries until the movements became instinctive. He learned to ride horses, to wear armor, to fight from both mounted and ground positions. He built strength through labor, helping with the abbey's daily work of farming and construction when he was not at his studies. The combination of physical and spiritual discipline was unusual for its time. Most knights focused on combat skills and left the spiritual concerns to the priests. Most priests devoted themselves to prayer and scholarship, leaving the fighting to the warriors. But Faol saw in Uther someone who could bridge this divide, who could embody both traditions without diminishing either. This vision would later shape the entire concept of the Paladin order. Uther proved to be an exceptional student in both the spiritual and martial aspects of his training. His prayers seemed to resonate with unusual power, and his skill with sword and hammer grew rapidly. More importantly, he embodied the virtues that the church taught, showing respect to all he encountered, pursuing his training with unwavering tenacity, and demonstrating compassion even to those who opposed him. The peaceful world in which Uther grew to manhood would not last forever. Far to the south, in the kingdom of Azeroth, events were unfolding that would change everything. A dark portal had opened in the Swamp of Sorrows, and through it poured creatures unlike anything humanity had ever seen. The orcs had come, and with them came war. The First War, as it would later be called, was devastating for the kingdom of Azeroth. The orcish horde, driven by demonic, bloodlust, and wielding strange Faol magics, swept across the land like a tide of destruction. Cities burned, villages were razed, and thousands died in the fighting. The human defenders, caught off guard by enemies they could not comprehend, struggled to mount an effective resistance. The orcs were unlike any enemy humanity had ever faced. They were massive creatures, their green skin and bestial features marking them as something fundamentally other. Their weapons were crude but effective, designed for maximum carnage rather than elegant combat. And they fought with a ferocity that seemed driven by something more than mere aggression, a burning hunger for violence that bordered on the supernatural. What the humans did not know, could not have known, was that this hunger came from demonic corruption. The orcs had been manipulated by agents of the Burning Legion, transformed from a shamanistic society into a weapon of destruction. The bloodlust they felt was artificial, imposed upon them by forces they barely understood. But this knowledge would not come until much later, and it would not have mattered to those fighting for survival in the burning fields of Azeroth. Archbishop Faol sent many of his Northshire clerics south to aid in the war effort. These priests were skilled healers, able to mend wounds and cure diseases through the power of the light. They followed the armies into battle, tending to the injured and offering spiritual comfort to the dying. Their presence saved countless lives and bolstered the morale of the beleaguered defenders. But the clerics were not warriors. They carried no weapons and wore no armor. Their faith protected them to some degree, but against the savage fury of the horde, faith alone was not enough. Many of the clerics fell in battle, cut down by orcish blades while trying to heal wounded soldiers. The order that Faol had built over decades was decimated in a matter of months. Uther watched these events unfold with growing horror. He saw friends and mentors march south, never to return. He heard reports of clerics slaughtered while performing their sacred duties, and he came to understand with painful clarity that the old ways were not sufficient for the new world they faced. Faith was essential, but faith without the ability to defend oneself was merely an invitation to martyrdom. The first war ended in catastrophe for the kingdom of Azeroth. The capital of Stormwind fell to the Horde, its king slain and its people scattered. Refugees by the thousands fled north, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and the trauma of what they had witnessed. Among these refugees was a young warrior named Anduin Lothar, the last of the Arathi bloodline, and the man who would lead humanity's counterattack. The survivors of Azeroth found shelter in Lordaeron, where King Tyrannus Menethil II offered them sanctuary. The northern kingdoms, previously isolated from the Orcish threat, now understood that they faced a common enemy. The alliance of Lordaeron began to take shape, uniting the human kingdoms, along with the dwarves of Ironforge, the gnomes of Gnomrigan, and the high elves of Quel'Thalas. It was during this time of crisis that Archbishop Faol conceived of a new order, one that would combine the spiritual power of the light with the martial prowess of a knight. He had seen his clerics die helpless on the battlefield, and he was determined that such tragedies would not be repeated. The new order would be able to heal and to protect, to inspire and to defend. They would be warriors of the light in every sense of the word. Archbishop Alonsus Faol was no longer young when he began his greatest work. The first war had aged him beyond his years, each report of clerics slain adding another weight to his shoulders. But his mind remained sharp, and his vision was clearer than ever. He understood that the world had changed, that the peaceful existence humanity had known was gone forever, and that new solutions were needed for new challenges. The concept of the paladin was radical for its time. The church had always maintained a separation between those who wielded the light for healing and blessing and those who took up arms in defense of the realm. Priests were priests, and knights were knights, each with their own roles and responsibilities. Faol proposed to merge these traditions, creating warriors who could channel the light's power while clad in armor and wielding weapons of war. Some within the church hierarchy opposed this innovation. They argued that the light was meant for healing and comfort, not for violence and destruction. They feared that mixing martial training with spiritual practice would corrupt both, creating something that was neither true priest nor honorable knight. These objections were sincere, and Faol took them seriously, but ultimately he believed that the need was too great for tradition to stand in the way. Anduin, Lothar, the supreme allied commander and regent of Stormwind, supported Faol's vision. He had seen the Horde's brutality firsthand, had watched his kingdom burn and his people die. He understood that humanity needed every advantage it could muster if it was to survive. When Faol came to him with the proposal for a new order, Lothar gave his blessing immediately. With Lothar's support, Faol began the process of selecting candidates for his new order. He needed individuals who possessed both spiritual sensitivity and martial aptitude, a rare combination even in a world full of knights and priests. The candidates would also need exceptional character, for they would be expected to embody the highest ideals of both the church and the knighthood. The first name on Faol's list was Uther. The archbishop had watched the young man grow from a promising student into a formidable warrior of the light. He had observed Uther's unwavering faith, his skill at arms, and his genuine compassion for those he served. Of all the potential candidates, Uther came closest to Faol's vision of what a paladin should be. 4 other candidates were selected to join Uther in the founding of the new order. Turalyon was a young priest who had shown unexpected aptitude for leadership and combat during the evacuation of Stormwind. Saeed Dathrohan was a knight of impeccable honor who had devoted himself to the church's teachings. Tyrion Fordring was a noble warrior, known throughout Lordaeron for his integrity and sense of justice. And Gavinrod the Deer was Lothar's personal recommendation, a fierce fighter whose devotion to protecting the innocent was legendary. The training of these 5 was intense and demanding. Faol personally oversaw their instruction, pushing them beyond what either priests or knights typically endured. They learned advanced techniques for channeling the light, methods that had never been taught outside the most senior ranks of the clergy. They practiced combat, forms that integrated spiritual power with martial skill, learning to enhance their weapons and armor with holy energy. The training also included meditation and prayer, hours spent in communion with the light seeking guidance and strength. The candidates had to confront their own doubts and fears, their anger and pride, purging themselves of anything that might interfere with their connection to the light. This inner work was perhaps more difficult than the physical training, for it required absolute honesty about one's own flaws. The name for the new order came from an ancient legend, the tale of Tyr, one of the Titan-forged keepers who had shaped Azeroth in ages past. According to the legend, Tyr had sacrificed his own hand to protect his companions from a monstrous enemy. His severed hand, made of gleaming metal, had become a symbol of sacrifice and protection. The Knights of the Silver Hand would carry this symbol, pledging themselves to the same selfless service that Tyr's had exemplified. The ceremony to formally establish the order took place in Alonsis Chapel in Stratholme, one of the most sacred sites in Lordaeron. The chapel had been built centuries before, a testament to the devotion of the city's founders, and its walls still radiated with accumulated prayers and blessings. It was the perfect setting for the birth of something new and holy. The chapel itself was a masterwork of religious architecture. Stained glass windows depicted scenes from the history of the light, their colors casting patterns of red and gold and blue across the stone floors when sunlight streamed through them. Carved pillars that lined the central nave, each one bearing the image of a saint or holy figure from the church's long history. The altar stood at the far end, a simple block of white marble that seemed to glow with an inner radiance. Dignitaries from across the Alliance filled the pews on that historic day. King Terenas Menethil II sat in the place of honor, his expression solemn as he witnessed the birth of an order would defend his kingdom. Lords and ladies from every human nation were present, along with representatives from the dwarves and high elves. The air was thick with incense and anticipation. Outside the chapel, crowds had gathered in Stratholme's streets. Word of the ceremony had spread throughout the city, and ordinary citizens wanted to catch a glimpse of the new holy warriors. They pressed against the barriers that the city guard had erected, straining to see through the chapel's doors whenever they opened. Vendors moved through the crowd selling food and drink, while children played games that imitated the knights they hoped to see. Archbishop Faol presided over the ceremony, his voice carrying clearly through the chapel despite his age. He spoke of the challenges facing humanity, of the need for protectors who could stand against the darkness. He described the virtues that the new order would embody, the same virtues that the church had always taught, but now given martial form. And he called forth the 5 candidates, one by one, to receive their blessing. Uther was the first to kneel before the Archbishop. Faol placed his hands upon Uther's head and spoke words of consecration that had been written specifically for this moment. The light responded to the blessing, filling the chapel with golden radiance as it flowed into Uther's being. When he rose, he was no longer merely a knight or a priest. He was the first paladin, the Lightbringer, and the world would never be the same. Turalyon, Sidon, Tyrion, and Gavinrod received the same blessings in turn. Each knelt before Faol, each received the consecration, and each rose transformed. The 5 stood together at the altar, bound by a sacred oath to defend the innocent, to oppose evil, and to uphold the light no matter the cost. The Knights of the Silver Hand had been born. As part of the ceremony, Faol presented each paladin with an enchanted librum, a sacred book that would serve both as a source of wisdom and as a focus for their powers. Each librum represented a different aspect of the paladin's calling, chosen by Faol to match the strengths he perceived in each candidate. Uther received the librum of justice, for Faol saw in him an unwavering commitment to what was right and fair. Turalyon received the librum of protection, acknowledging his instinct to shield others from harm. Tyrion received the librum of retribution, honoring his determination to punish wrongdoing. Saidin received the librum of holiness, recognizing his deep spiritual devotion, and Gavinrod received the librum of compassion, celebrating his tenderness toward those in need. The creation of the Paladins sent ripples through both the church and the military. Some hailed the new order as exactly what humanity needed, warriors who could inspire hope and fear in equal measure. Others remained skeptical, wondering whether these hybrid knight priests could truly serve both traditions effectively. Only time and battle would prove which view was correct. The 5 paladins did not remain idle after their consecration. The Second War was already beginning, with Orcish forces massing for a new offensive against the Alliance. There would be no time for ceremonial celebrations or philosophical debates. The Silver Hand would be tested in battle almost immediately, their faith and training put to the ultimate proof. Word of the new order spread quickly through the Alliance armies. Soldiers who had despaired after the fall of Stormwind found new reason to hope. The Paladins were said to be blessed by the light itself, immune to fear and capable of miraculous feats. While these rumors exaggerated the truth, they served to boost morale at a time when morale was desperately needed. The Paladins themselves remained humble despite the attention. They knew that they were untested, that their training was theoretical, until proven in combat. They prepared themselves mentally and spiritually for what was to come, spending hours in prayer and meditation. Uther, in particular, felt the weight of expectation, knowing that as the first paladin, he would be watched more closely than any of the others. The Second War began with the Horde's massive invasion of Lordaeron. Orgrim Doomhammer, the Orcish war chief who had conquered Stormwind, led his armies north in a campaign of conquest and destruction. The Alliance forces, still organizing and still recovering from the First War, struggled to mount an effective defense. The first major engagement where the Paladins proved their worth was the Battle of Hillsbrad Foothills. The Horde had pushed deep into Alliance territory, threatening to cut off the human forces and leave them vulnerable to encirclement. The situation was desperate, with soldiers breaking under the pressure and units disintegrating in the face of orcish ferocity. Into this chaos rode the Knights of the Silver Hand. The 5 paladins led a charge through the Alliance lines, their armor gleaming and their weapons blazing with holy light. The sight of them restored courage to wavering soldiers and terror to the hearts of their enemies. It was as if figures from legend had stepped onto the battlefield, beings of light and power who could not be defeated by mere mortal weapons. Uther was at the forefront of the charge, his hammer swinging in great arcs that sent orcs flying with each impact. The light flowed through him, enhancing his strength and speed beyond human limits. When orcish blades struck his armor, they slid away as if deflected by an invisible shield. When he called upon the light to heal wounded soldiers, their injuries closed in moments rather than days. The battle was still hard fought, and the paladins were not invincible. They took wounds, they grew weary, and they watched soldiers die despite their best efforts. But their presence turned the tide, transforming what had been a desperate retreat into a successful holding action. The Horde was stopped at Hillsbraid, and the Alliance gained precious time to organize its defenses. In the aftermath of the battle, Turalyon approached Uther with a suggestion. He proposed that Uther be given a title, a name that captured his ability to bring hope in the darkest moments. Turalyon had witnessed Uther's charge into the enemy ranks, had seen the way soldiers rallied around him, and believed that such courage deserved recognition. The name he suggested was Lightbringer, for Uther truly seemed to bring light wherever darkness threatened to overwhelm. Uther was reluctant to accept the title at first. He felt that his actions were no more heroic than those of his fellow paladins, that he was simply doing what the light required of him. But Turalyon persisted, and eventually Uther accepted the name. From that day forward, he was known as Uther the Lightbringer, first paladin of the Silver Hand. The Second War continued for months, with battles across multiple fronts and fortunes shifting back and forth. The paladins served wherever they were needed most, sometimes fighting together and sometimes separated to bolster different alliance forces. They proved themselves again and again, earning reputations that would endure for generations. The war tested not just the paladins' combat abilities, but also their spiritual resolve. They witnessed atrocities that challenged their faith, acts of cruelty that made them question whether the light could truly triumph over such darkness. They saw villages burned with their inhabitants still inside, prisoners tortured for information or simply for sport, and corpses defiled in ways that defied description. Each horror they witnessed could have broken them, could have turned them bitter or vengeful or despairing. But Uther and his brothers maintained their commitment to the light's principles. They treated prisoners humanely, even when others called for execution. They showed mercy to those who surrendered, even though many in the Alliance believed that orcs deserved no mercy. They held to their code, even when it would have been easier to abandon it, understanding that what they stood for was as important as any military victory. The healing abilities of the paladins proved invaluable on the battlefield. Before their creation, wounded soldiers often died from injuries that could have been survivable with proper treatment. The army's healers were too few and too slow to reach everyone who needed help, but a paladin could channel the light to close wounds in moments, to purge infection, to restore strength to those who had lost it. This ability saved thousands of lives over the course of the war. Uther became known for his willingness to heal anyone, regardless of rank or status. He treated common foot soldiers with the same care he showed to generals and nobles. He ministered to the frightened and the despairing, offering not just physical healing, but also spiritual comfort. His bedside manner, as much as his combat prowess, made him beloved among the troops. The psychological toll of the war was something the paladins were uniquely equipped to address. Soldiers who had seen too much death, who had been pushed beyond their breaking points, found solace in the presence of the Silver Hand. The paladins listened to their fears and doubts, offered counsel based on the light's teachings, and helped them find the strength to continue. This pastoral work was less dramatic than their battlefield heroics, but arguably just as important. Uther participated in some of the bloodiest engagements of the war. He was present at the siege of Lordaeron itself, when Doomhammer's forces threatened to conquer the Alliance's greatest city. The Orcish army had pushed deep into the heartland of the kingdom, their war machines and fell magic clearing paths through defenses that had stood for centuries. The capital itself came under threat, its walls surrounded by enemies who seemed determined to burn it to the ground. The defense of Lordaeron required every resource the Alliance could muster. Knights from all the human kingdoms, dwarven riflemen from Ironforge, and even a contingent of high elven mages combined their strength to hold the line. Uther served as a rallying point for these diverse forces, his presence on the walls inspiring soldiers who had never fought together before to work as one. The siege lasted for weeks, with assaults coming at all hours of the day and night. The orcs built siege towers and battering rams, hurling themselves at the walls with reckless abandon. The defenders poured down arrows and fire, pushed ladders away from the battlements, and fought hand to hand wherever the enemy managed to breach the defenses. The death toll mounted on both sides, but neither would yield. Uther seemed to be everywhere at once during these desperate days, healed wounded soldiers so they could return to the fight. He blessed the weapons of those about to face the enemy, enhancing their power with the light. He stood in the breach when walls were broken, his hammer creating space for others to fill. And when morale flagged, when soldiers began to despair, his voice rang out with words of encouragement that rekindled their determination. The siege was eventually broken by a counterattack that struck the Orcish supply lines. Deprived of reinforcements and provisions, Doomhammer's forces were forced to withdraw. The capital had been saved, though at tremendous cost. Thousands lay dead, and the surrounding countryside had been devastated. But Lordaeron stood, and the Alliance had proven that it could not be easily conquered. Uther also fought in the forests of Quel'Thalas, defending the high elven homeland from Orcish invasion. The elves had initially been reluctant to join the Alliance, their long lives making them wary of human affairs. But the Horde's attack on their sacred forests changed their perspective. They asked for aid, and Uther was among those sent to provide it. The war in Quel'Thalas was unlike anything Uther had experienced before. The ancient forests were maze-like, their magical nature confusing those unfamiliar with their paths. The elves fought with bows and magic, striking from concealment and fading into the trees before the orcs could respond. Uther had to adapt his tactics, learning to work with allies whose methods differed greatly from the straightforward charges of human cavalry. The experience deepened Uther's appreciation for the diversity of the alliance. The elves were strange to him, their immortality and magical nature setting them apart from humanity. But they shared the same goals, the same determination to protect their homes from destruction. Working alongside them, Uther came to see that the light's values transcended racial boundaries, that respect and compassion applied to all peoples, and he was there for the final assault on the dark portal, helping to end the war once and for all. During the campaign, Uther uncovered evidence of treachery within the Alliance itself. While traveling to Darrowmere Lake on a mission, he was ambushed by pirates who bore the colors of Alterac, one of the human kingdoms supposedly allied against the Horde. His investigation revealed that Lord Paranolde of Alterac had betrayed the Alliance, providing intelligence and passage to the Orcish forces in exchange for promises that his kingdom would be spared. The revelation of Alterac's betrayal caused a political crisis within the Alliance. Trust between the member kingdoms, never entirely solid, was further shaken. Uther's role in exposing the treachery earned him respect as not just a warrior, but also a man of principle who would pursue justice regardless of political consequences. The final battle of the Second War took place at the Dark Portal in the Blasted Lands. The Alliance forces, led by Anduin Lothar, launched an assault to destroy the gateway and prevent any more orcs from entering Azeroth. The fighting was fierce, with both sides understanding that this battle would determine the war's outcome. The Blasted Lands themselves were a testament to the wrongness of the Horde's presence on Azeroth. Once fertile territory, the region had been twisted by the portal's energies into a wasteland of red soil and dying vegetation. Strange creatures prowled its borders, mutated by the magical contamination that leaked from the dimensional rift. Even the sky seemed wrong here, tinged with colors that had no place in the natural world. The Alliance army that assembled for the final assault was the largest force ever gathered on Azeroth. Every nation of the Alliance had contributed troops, understanding that this battle would determine the fate of the entire continent. Humans, dwarves, gnomes, and high elves stood together, their banners creating a sea of color that stretched across the blasted landscape. The Orcish defenders were equally determined. They knew that defeat here would mean the end of their invasion, the loss of everything they had fought and died for over years of war. Doomhammer had gathered his remaining forces around the portal, building fortifications and preparing for the assault he knew was coming. The Horde would not fall without a fight. The battle began at dawn, with the Alliance forces advancing in disciplined formations across the wasteland. Artillery mages hurled fireballs and lightning at the Orcish positions, while dwarven riflemen picked off exposed defenders. The heavy infantry moved forward behind shields, absorbing the counterfire as they closed the distance. Uther fought alongside Turalyon in the assault on the portal. When Lothar fell in single combat against Doomhammer, it was Turalyon who picked up his fallen commander's sword and rallied the Alliance forces for a final push. Uther supported him throughout, his healing abilities keeping wounded soldiers in the fight, and his presence inspiring those who might otherwise have fled. The Alliance was victorious. The Dark Portal was destroyed, Doomhammer was captured, and the Horde was broken as a fighting force. The Second War was over, and humanity had survived. But the cost had been enormous, with thousands dead and entire regions left devastated. The work of rebuilding would take years, perhaps decades. In the aftermath of victory, Uther returned to Lordaeron to help with the reconstruction. He was honored as a hero, one of the saviors of the Alliance, but he took no pleasure in the accolades. He had seen too much death, had witnessed too much destruction to celebrate. Instead, he devoted himself to healing the wounds of war, both physical and spiritual. The years following the Second War were a time of recovery for the Alliance. Cities had to be rebuilt, refugees had to be resettled, and a new order had to be established. The Orcish prisoners were placed in internment camps while the Alliance debated what to do with them. Some advocated execution, arguing that the orcs were too dangerous to be allowed to live. Others, including many paladins, argued for mercy, believing that even the orcs might be capable of redemption. Uther and his fellow paladins of the Silver Hand were stationed in Stormwind City, where they assisted with the massive effort to rebuild the capital of the Southern Kingdom. The city had been reduced to ruins during the First War, and restoring it would require the labor of thousands over many years. The Paladins contributed not just their physical strength, but also their healing abilities, tending to workers injured in construction accidents and blessing the foundations of new buildings. The Cathedral of Light in Stormwind became the headquarters of the Silver Hand during this period. The cathedral was one of the first structures to be fully restored, a symbol of hope and faith thus amidst the reconstruction. Within its walls, Uther and the other paladins continued their training and accepted new recruits into the order. The order grew significantly during the years of peace. Knights from across the Alliance sought to join, drawn by the paladins' reputation and inspired by their example. Uther personally trained many of these new recruits, passing on the techniques and philosophies that Faol had taught him. He was a demanding instructor, expecting nothing less than complete dedication, but also a compassionate one who understood that everyone learned at their own pace. Beyond formal training, Uther spent much of his time in simple service to the people. He helped the sick in Stormwind's hospitals, drawing upon the light to cure diseases that would otherwise prove fatal. He comforted the elderly in their final days, assuring them that the light awaited them beyond death. He assisted women giving birth, his presence bringing calm to difficult deliveries. And he worked with orphans, children who had lost their parents to war, providing guidance and support as they grew. This service was not glamorous work. It did not involve charging into battle or defeating powerful enemies. But Uther believed it was essential to what being a paladin meant. The light was not just a weapon to be wielded against darkness. It was a force for healing and comfort, for helping people in their everyday struggles. A paladin who only fought battles was missing the larger purpose of their calling. The political situation in the Alliance remained complex during these years. The human kingdoms, united against the common threat of the Horde, began to quarrel among themselves once that threat was removed. Old rivalries resurfaced, Disputes over territory and trade flared up, and the alliance threatened to fragment. The Paladins tried to remain above these political conflicts, serving all the kingdoms equally, but it was not always possible to stay neutral. King Tyrannus Menethil II of Lordaeron worked tirelessly to hold the alliance together. He was a wise and patient ruler, able to mediate disputes and find compromises that satisfied all parties. Uther served as an informal advisor to the king, their shared devotion to the light creating a bond of mutual respect. The Lightbringer's counsel was valued at the highest levels of government. During this time, Uther became acquainted with the king's young son, Prince Arthas. The boy was energetic and curious, fascinated by the knights and paladins who served his father. He would often sneak away from his tutors to watch the Silver Hand train, his eyes wide with admiration. Uther found the prince endearing, seeing in him the same eagerness to serve that had characterized his own youth. As Arthas grew older, it became clear that he was destined for great things. He showed aptitude for both combat and leadership, excelling in his training and earning the respect of his instructors. King Tyrannus began to consider who might serve as the prince's final teacher, the mentor who would guide him through the transition from boy to man, from prince to future king. The choice fell upon Uther. The Lightbringer was the most respected paladin in the kingdom, a man whose integrity and skill were beyond question. He had known Arthas since childhood and had always treated the boy with kindness, and his own lack of political ambition made him trustworthy in a court where everyone else seemed to be scheming for advantage. Uther accepted the responsibility with his characteristic seriousness. He understood that he was not just training a warrior or even a paladin. He was shaping the future king of Lordaeron, a man who would one day hold millions of lives in his hands. The stakes could not have been higher, and Uther was determined to do his best. The training began with the fundamentals, the same lessons that every paladin learned. Arthas had already received basic instruction in combat and the light, but Uther deepened this education, pushing the prince to master techniques that many paladins never achieved. He also focused on character development, constantly challenging Arthas to examine his motivations and confront his weaknesses. The days followed a structured routine that Uther had developed over years of training paladins. They rose before dawn for meditation and prayer, greeting the light as it returned to the world. Breakfast was simple and eaten in silence, a time for reflection on the day ahead. Then came physical training, hours of drills, and practice that built strength, endurance, and combat skill. Uther was a demanding instructor, accepting nothing less than the prince's best effort. When Arthas grew tired, Uther pushed him to continue. When Arthas became frustrated, Uther taught him to channel that frustration into focus. When Arthas succeeded, Uther offered measured praise, but immediately challenged him with something more difficult. The goal was not just to make Arthas a capable warrior, but to prepare him for the burdens of leadership. The afternoons were devoted to study and discussion. They would read from the holy texts together, with Uther explaining the meaning behind the words, and Arthas asking questions that revealed his sharp intellect. They discussed history, learning from the successes and failures of leaders past. They debated ethics, working through hypothetical situations where the right course of action was unclear. These discussions often continued into the evening meals, which they took together in Uther's quarters. The Lightbringer would share stories from his own experience, recounting battles and decisions that had shaped his understanding of duty. Arthas listened with rapt attention, absorbing not just the facts, but the wisdom that came from a lifetime of service. The training also included practical service to the people of Lordaeron. Uther believed that a true paladin must understand the lives of those he protected. He took Arthas to hospitals and orphanages, to farming villages and mining towns. They helped with harvests, assisted with construction, and listened to the concerns of ordinary citizens. These experiences grounded Arthas, reminding him that the kingdom he would one day rule was made up of real people with real needs. Uther also introduced Arthas to the wider world of the Alliance. They traveled to Ironforge, where the prince learned about dwarven culture and engineering. They visited Quel'Thalas, experiencing the ancient magic of the High Elves. They even made a pilgrimage to the reconstructed Stormwind, paying respects at the memorial to those who had died in the First War. Each journey expanded Arthas's understanding of the realms he would one day help lead. The relationship between mentor and student deepened over the years. Uther came to see Arthas as almost a son, taking pride in his achievements and worrying about his struggles. Arthas, for his part, idolized Uther, striving to live up to the example the Lightbringer set. Their bond seemed unbreakable, forged in shared values and mutual respect. Together, they rode throughout Lordaeron, dispensing justice and protecting the innocent. They investigated crimes, settled disputes, and defended villages from bandits and monsters. These missions served both as practical training for Arthas and as genuine service to the kingdom. The prince learned firsthand what it meant to wield power responsibly, to use strength in defense of the weak. There were moments of concern, hints that all was not perfect in the prince's development. Arthas could be impetuous, rushing into situations without fully considering the consequences. He struggled with patience, wanting immediate solutions to problems that required careful deliberation. And he had difficulty accepting failure, taking defeats personally, and dwelling on them longer than was healthy. Uther addressed these issues as they arose, counseling Arthas toward patience and humility. The prince responded well to guidance, acknowledging his flaws and working to overcome them. Progress was made, if slowly, and Uther remained optimistic that Arthas would grow into the wise and just ruler that Lordaeron needed. The years of peace would not last forever. Far to the north, in the frozen continent of Northrend, dark forces were stirring. The Lich King, a malevolent entity created by the Burning Legion, was preparing to unleash a plague upon the world. The Scourge was coming, and nothing would ever be the same. The Lich King was no ordinary enemy. He had been created by the demon lord Kil'jaeden as a weapon to soften Azeroth for invasion, to turn its populations against each other through a plague that raised the dead as mindless servants. The spirit of the Orcish shaman Ner'zhul had been bound into a suit of armor and frozen into a block of ice, atop Icecrown Glacier, his power growing as he reached out to corrupt the living world. The plague was his greatest weapon. Unlike conventional diseases that merely killed, this plague transformed its victims into undead creatures that retained no memory of their former lives. Worse, the newly risen dead would attack the living, spreading the infection further. It was a self-perpetuating weapon of apocalyptic proportions, capable of turning entire kingdoms into charnel houses. The cult of the damned served as the Lich King's agents in the mortal world. These deluded fools had been promised eternal life in exchange for their service, not understanding that the eternity they would receive was one of mindless servitude. They distributed the plagued grain to unsuspecting communities, poisoned wells and food supplies, and performed the rituals necessary to awaken the dead. All of this was unknown to Uther and the other defenders of Lordaeron when the first reports began to arrive. They had no framework for understanding what they faced, no experience with enemies of this nature. The Orcish horde had been brutal and terrifying, but at least the orcs were alive, could be reasoned with on some level, could be defeated through conventional means. The Scourge was something entirely different. The Third War began not with a massive invasion, but with strange reports from the northern regions of Lordaeron. Villages were going silent, their inhabitants found dead or simply vanished. Travelers spoke of shambling corpses on the roads, of farms abandoned overnight, of a creeping sense of wrongness that pervaded the land. At first, these reports were dismissed as hysteria or exaggeration. Lordaeron had known years of peace, and people had grown complacent. The authorities sent investigators to look into the claims, but many of these investigators never returned. Those who did brought back stories that were difficult to believe, tales of undead creatures and a mysterious plague that turned the living into mindless horrors. King Tyrannus grew concerned as the reports continued to multiply. He ordered Uther and the Silver Hand to investigate, to determine what was happening in the north and to stop it if possible. The Paladins mobilized quickly, their training for exactly these kinds of threats about to be put to the ultimate test. Before Uther departed, a new concern arose. Reports reached Lordaeron that orc camps were being spotted in the wilderness, that the greenskins who had been thought broken were somehow regrouping. This new threat could not be ignored, and the king ordered a force to deal with it as well. Prince Arthas begged to be included in the mission. He was young but fully trained, a paladin in his own right, and eager to prove himself in real combat. King Tyrannus was reluctant to send his heir into danger, but Arthas's determination was fierce. Eventually, the king relented, assigning Arthas to serve under Uther's command. The two paladins rode together to the town of Stranbrad, where orc raiders from the Blackrock clan had been sighted. It was intended to be a relatively straightforward mission, clearing out a small band of renegades, a chance for Arthas to gain experience under Uther's watchful eye. The reality would prove more complicated. The battle at Stranbrad was intense, but ultimately successful. The Blackrock orcs were defeated, and the town was secured. Arthas distinguished himself in the fighting, showing both courage and skill. Uther was proud of his student, believing that the prince was ready for greater challenges. But even as they celebrated their victory, disturbing news arrived. The plague they had heard rumors of was real and spreading rapidly. Entire towns were being infected, their populations turning into undead creatures within days. The source of the plague had been traced to infected grain shipments, which meant that it could already be present in communities. Throughout Lordaeron, Uther and Arthas were dispatched to investigate further. They traveled to regions affected by the plague, witnessing firsthand the horror it caused. They found villages filled with corpses that rose to attack the living, fields littered with the bodies of farmers who had eaten contaminated bread, roads choked with refugees fleeing the spreading infection. The young paladin, Jaina Proudmoore, joined them during this investigation. She was a powerful mage, one of the most talented to emerge from Dalaran in generations, and a childhood friend of Arthas. The three of them worked together to understand the plague and find a way to stop it, but every answer they found only led to more questions. They discovered that the plague was not natural, but had been deliberately created and spread. A being called Mal'Ganis, a powerful demon of the Burning Legion, was behind the infection. He seemed to be working towards some larger goal, though what exactly remained unclear. The demon taunted them with cryptic hints about destiny and doom, always staying one step ahead. The investigation took them to Andorhal, where they discovered the granaries from which the plagued grain had been distributed. The town itself was already falling to the infection, its inhabitants transforming into undead even as the heroes arrived. They fought through the streets, cutting down shambling corpses that had been farmers and merchants just days before, racing to uncover the source of the contamination. What they found in the granaries was chilling. Crates of infected grain bore shipping manifests showing they had been sent throughout the kingdom. Towns and villages across Lordaeron had received this tainted food, were even now consuming it, without knowing the fate that awaited them. The scale of the infection was far larger than they had imagined, a kingdom-wide catastrophe in the making. Uther urged caution. He suggested alerting the other authorities, coordinating a response that could address the full scope of the threat. There were other paladins, other armies, other resources that could be brought to bear if they were given time to organize. Rushing ahead without a plan risked missing something crucial, making the situation worse instead of better. But time was something they did not have. Each day that passed meant more people eating the infected grain, more victims joining the scourge's ranks. Arthas argued that they could not wait, that every hour of delay condemned thousands more to death. His logic was sound, but it was also desperate, driven by emotion as much as reason. Mal'Ganis appeared to them personally, taunting and goading. The demon seemed to take particular interest in Arthas, focusing his provocations on the young prince while barely acknowledging the others. He spoke of destiny and fate, of paths already chosen, of darkness that called to darkness. His words seemed designed to inflame Arthas's anger and frustration. Uther watched these exchanges with growing concern. He had trained Arthas to control his emotions, to channel his passion into righteous purpose rather than blind rage. But the demon's taunts were finding their mark, piercing defenses that should have been stronger. Something in Arthas was responding to Mal'Ganis, something that Uther did not understand and could not reach. As the investigation continued, Arthas became increasingly frustrated and angry. He took every death personally, blaming himself for not being able to prevent the spread of the plague. His frustration manifested as impatience, a desire for immediate action rather than careful planning. Uther tried to counsel patience, to remind the prince that rushing into situations could make things worse, but his warnings fell on increasingly deaf ears. The turning point came at Stratholme. The city was one of the largest in Lordaeron, second only to the capital itself. When Arthas and his companions arrived, they discovered that infected grain shipments had already been distributed throughout the city. The citizens had consumed the tainted food and would soon begin transforming into undead. Arthas made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his existence. He ordered the immediate purging of Stratholme, the killing of every man, woman, and child within its walls, before they could transform and spread the plague further. In his mind, it was the only logical choice. The people were already dead, their fate sealed the moment they ate the infected grain. Killing them now was mercy compared to what they would become. Uther was horrified. He understood the logic behind Arthas's reasoning, but he could not accept the action itself. The light that flowed through him recoiled at the thought of slaughtering innocent people, no matter what they might become. These were citizens of Lordaeron, people he had sworn to protect. He could not raise his hand against them. The confrontation between mentor and student was fierce. Arthas accused Uther of cowardice, of letting sentiment override duty. Uther accused Arthas of abandoning his principles, of becoming the very thing they were supposed to fight against. Voices were raised, harsh words exchanged, years of trust and respect crumbling in moments. The argument took place before the gates of Stratholme, with soldiers from both camps watching in uncomfortable silence. No one dared intervene in the dispute between the prince and the Lightbringer, but everyone present understood that something fundamental was breaking. The two men who had exemplified the bond between teacher and student, who had ridden together through countless adventures, were now standing as enemies. Uther tried one last time to reach the prince. He spoke of the light's teachings, of the importance of preserving innocent life, of finding another way. Perhaps they could quarantine the city, could search for a cure, could give the people a chance. Even if that chance was small, was it not worth taking? The light demanded compassion, demanded that they exhaust every alternative before resorting to slaughter. Arthas's response was cold. He reminded Uther of their duty to protect the kingdom, of the greater good that required sacrifice. If they showed mercy here, the plague would spread to other cities, would consume all of Lordaeron. How many more would die because they lacked the courage to act decisively? The light demanded justice, and justice required hard choices. Neither man would yield. They stood facing each other, the gulf between them growing wider with every word. The soldiers watched, knowing that their world was changing before their eyes. Whatever happened in Stratholme, the Silver Hand would never be the same. Arthas made his decision. As Prince of Lordaeron, he held authority over the military forces present. He invoked that authority, disbanding the Knights of the Silver Hand on the spot and dismissing Uther from his service. Anyone who refused to participate in the culling was branded a traitor to the kingdom. Uther stood in shock, unable to believe what he was hearing. The boy he had trained, the student he had loved like a son, was ordering him to leave or face charges of treason. The sacred order that Uther had helped found was being dissolved by royal decree. Everything he had built over decades was falling apart in a single moment. Jaina pleaded with Arthas to reconsider, but the prince's mind was made. He turned away from both of them, gathering those soldiers who remained loyal to him and marching toward Stratholme's gates. The screams began shortly thereafter, the sounds of people dying at the hands of their own prince. Uther led his paladins away from the city, away from the massacre. They could hear the sounds of killing behind them, smell the smoke as buildings began to burn. Some of his knights wept openly, their faith in their order and their prince shattered. Others simply walked in silence, too numb to process what had happened. The culling of Stratholme lasted through the night. When it was over, thousands lay dead, cut down by the soldiers who should have protected them. Arthas emerged from the city changed, something fundamental in him broken or transformed. He announced that he would pursue Mal'Ganis to the ends of the earth and left Lordaeron with a force of loyal soldiers. The soldiers who remained loyal to Arthas were those who had been closest to him, men who had followed him into battle before and trusted his judgment implicitly. They did not question his decision at Stratholme, either because they agreed with it or because they could not bring themselves to oppose their prince. These men would accompany him to Northrend, would share in his subsequent descent, and would be among the first to join his undead armies. Those who refused to participate in the culling faced difficult choices in its aftermath. Some sought out Uther and the Silver Hand, hoping to find guidance from the paladin who had stood against the prince. Others fled the kingdom entirely, unable to serve a realm that could produce such horrors. Still others tried to carry on as if nothing had changed, burying their memories and their consciences beneath a facade of normalcy. The kingdom of Lordaeron reacted to news of the culling with shock and denial. King Tyrannus initially refused to believe the reports, convinced that his son could not have ordered such an atrocity. When the evidence became undeniable, the king retreated into silence, unable to reconcile his love for Arthas with the horror of what Arthas had done. The government functioned through the efforts of advisors and ministers, while the king grieved in private. Uther and Jaina returned to the ruins of Stratholme after the prince departed. They walked through streets littered with bodies, saw the faces of children who had been killed by royal command. The experience left wounds that would never fully heal, memories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The Silver Hand had been officially disbanded, but Uther refused to accept that the order was truly dead. He gathered his remaining paladins and continued their work, operating without royal sanction, but with the conviction that their cause remained just. They could not undo what had happened at Stratholme, but they could still serve the light and protect those who remained. The months following the culling were dark ones for Lordaeron. The plague continued to spread despite all efforts to contain it, and reports from the north grew increasingly dire. Arthas had sailed to Northrend in pursuit of Mal'Ganis, and no word came back from his expedition. Many feared that the prince was dead, lost in the frozen wastes along with his soldiers. Uther maintained hope that Arthas might still be saved. He believed that the prince's actions at Stratholme were the result of desperation and manipulation, not a true reflection of his character. The young man that Uther had trained, the paladin who had sworn to uphold the light, was still in there somewhere, or so Uther wanted to believe. The truth, when it arrived, was worse than anyone had imagined. Arthas returned to Lordaeron, but not as the prince who had left. He had found the cursed Runeblade Frostmourne in Northrend, trading his soul for the power to defeat Mal'Ganis. The blade had corrupted him completely, transforming him into a death knight in service to the Lich King. Arthas entered the capital city of Lordaeron as a returning hero, welcomed by crowds who did not understand what he had become. He made his way to the throne room where his father waited, opened the door, and approached the king. The words he spoke were those of a loving son reunited with his parent. Then he drew Frostmourne and murdered King Tyrrhenus where he sat. The death of the king threw Lordaeron into chaos. Arthas seized control of the kingdom, using his authority and the element of surprise to crush any opposition. Those who resisted were killed, their bodies raised as undead soldiers to serve the new master. The Scourge had claimed Lordaeron, and its prince had become its instrument. Uther learned of the king's death with devastating grief. He had served Tyrrhenus for decades, had counseled him, and fought for him, and believed in his vision for the Alliance. More than a king, Tyrrhenus had been a friend, one of the few people Uther had allowed himself to be close to, and now he was dead, murdered by the very son he had loved. The Lightbringer gathered his remaining forces and tried to organize resistance against the Scourge, but the situation was nearly hopeless. The undead armies were vast and growing larger with every battle, each fallen soldier rising to join their ranks. The living forces of Lordaeron were fragmented, demoralized, and outnumbered. Uther personally recovered the ashes of King Tyrrhenus, placing them in a specially blessed urn that would protect them from necromantic magic. He swore to guard those ashes with his life, to ensure that the king would not be desecrated further by his murderous son. It was the only thing he could do for the man he had served. The final confrontation came at Andorhal, a town in the western Plaguelands, where Uther and a force of surviving paladins had established a headquarters. It was one of the few places in Lordaeron still under Alliance control, a beacon of resistance in a land consumed by death. From there, they launched attacks against the Scourge and offered sanctuary to refugees. Andorhal had been a prosperous town before the plague, known throughout Lordaeron for its grain production. The fields surrounding it had fed much of the kingdom, and its granaries were legendary for their capacity. Now those same granaries were fortified positions, their thick walls providing shelter against the undead hordes that roamed the countryside. Uther had chosen this location deliberately. It was defensible, with natural barriers that would slow any attacking force. It was symbolic, representing the agricultural heart of Lordaeron that the Scourge sought to destroy. And it was practical, with supplies that could sustain a force of survivors through the dark days ahead. The Paladins who gathered at Andorhal were a diverse group. Some were veterans of the Silver Hand, who had served alongside Uther since the Second War. Others were newer members who had taken up the call after witnessing the Scourge's atrocities. A few were not paladins at all, but simply warriors and priests who had nowhere else to turn. United by their determination to resist, they formed a community of the faithful in a world that had gone mad. Daily life in Andorhal revolved around survival and resistance. Scouts ventured out to gather intelligence on Scourge movements, often not returning. Patrols kept watch on the roads, warning of approaching danger and rescuing any refugees they encountered. The wounded were tended in a makeshift hospital, while the dead were buried with proper rites to prevent their rising as undead. Uther led by example, participating in all aspects of the community's work. He took his turn on watch, standing guard through cold nights when the moans of distant undead carried on the wind. He helped maintain the fortifications, lifting heavy stones and directing repairs. He counseled the frightened and grieving, offering what comfort he could to those who had lost everything. The presence of the urn gave special significance to their outpost. Word had spread that the remains of King Tyrannus were protected at Andorhal, and this knowledge drew both refugees seeking safety and enemies seeking to desecrate the dead. Uther knew that eventually the scourge would come in force, that Arthas would not rest until he had claimed what he sought. Arthas came for the urn, needing it for some dark purpose that Uther could only imagine. The Death Knight arrived with an army of undead, overwhelming numbers against the handful of defenders. But Uther would not run, would not abandon his duty to protect what remained of his king. The battle was epic and tragic. Uther fought with all the power he possessed, channeling more of the light than he ever had before. His hammer blazed like a star, cutting through undead ranks and driving back creatures that should have been unstoppable. For a moment, it seemed that faith and righteousness might triumph over darkness and despair. The defenders of Andorhal sold their lives dearly. Every paladin and warrior fought with the knowledge that this would likely be their last battle, that there was no retreat and no surrender. They formed lines across the narrow streets, forcing the undead to come at them in waves that they could hold back for precious moments. When one defender fell, another stepped forward to take their place. The undead army was vast beyond counting. Ghouls and zombies swarmed forward in endless tides, their rotting bodies absorbing blows that would have slain living soldiers. Skeletal warriors wielded rusted weapons with mechanical precision, feeling no fear and knowing no fatigue. Abominations, monstrous constructs of stitched flesh and bone, crashed through barricades that had taken days to build. But the light was with the defenders. When Uther raised his hammer and called upon the sacred power, golden radiance swept across the battlefield. Undead creatures burst into flames, their corrupted flesh unable to withstand the pure energy. Wounded defenders felt their injuries close, their strength renewed by the healing warmth. For a time, it seemed that faith alone might be enough to turn the tide. The surviving paladins fought beside their leader, each one channeling the light with desperation and devotion. Their hammers and swords blazed with holy fire, cutting paths through the undead ranks. Their shields glowed with protective energy, deflecting blows that should have been fatal. Together, they formed an island of light in a sea of darkness. Uther faced Arthas directly, mentor against student, Lightbringer against Death Knight. Their weapons clashed in eruptions of warring energies, holy light against unholy shadow. Uther struck Arthas down, sending the Death Knight sprawling to the ground. For one brief instant, victory seemed possible, but Frostmourne was no ordinary weapon. It drew upon the power of the Lich King himself, a reservoir of dark energy that could not be exhausted. Arthas rose again, renewed by his blade's hunger, and pressed the attack. Uther, already weary from the battle, could not match the Death Knight's unholy stamina. The final blow came from behind, a strike that Uther never saw. Frostmourne pierced his armor, pierced his flesh, and did something far worse than kill him. The Runeblade's curse reached into his very soul, tearing it apart, even as it consumed his life. Uther fell, the first paladin, dead at the hands of his beloved student. The remaining defenders were quickly overwhelmed. Arthas claimed the urn of his father's ashes and departed, leaving Andorhal to the scourge. The town that had been a refuge became another monument to the undead's victory, its streets filled with shambling corpses. But some loyal soldiers escaped the slaughter. They recovered Uther's body and carried it away from the devastation, determined that the Lightbringer would receive the burial he deserved. They journeyed south through lands crawling with undead, protecting their precious burden with their lives. The journey was perilous beyond measure. The surviving soldiers had to navigate through territory that was rapidly falling to the scourge, avoiding patrols of undead that seemed to be everywhere. They traveled by night when they could, hiding during the day in abandoned farms and ruined buildings. Several times they came close to discovery, and more than one of their number fell protecting the others. The body of Uther was wrapped in consecrated cloths and carried on a simple stretcher. Despite the circumstances, the soldiers treated it with the utmost reverence. They took turns bearing the burden, refusing to let fatigue or exhaustion prevent them from completing their sacred duty. The Lightbringer had given his life for Lordaeron, and they would ensure that sacrifice was honored. When they finally reached safe territory, the soldiers were met by other survivors of the Scourge's advance. Word spread quickly that Uther's body had been recovered, and paladins from across the remaining Alliance territories came to pay their respects. The funeral was a gathering of grief and determination, a moment when the scattered remnants of the Silver Hand came together to mourn their founder. A tomb was built for Uther in the western Plaguelands, east of what would become Chillwind Camp. It was a simple structure, but it was blessed with powerful wards that kept the undead at bay. A marker stone was placed bearing words that would endure through all the trials to come. The inscription read, "Here lies Uther the Lightbringer, first paladin, founder of the Order of the Silver Hand. Uther lived and died to defend the kingdom of Lordaeron. Though he was betrayed by his most beloved student, we believe that his spirit lives on. He continues to watch over us, even as the shadows close in around our ruined land. His light is the light of all humanity, and so long as we honor his example, it shall never fade." The death of Uther the Lightbringer marked the end of an era, but his legacy endured long after his body was laid to rest. The Silver Hand, though officially disbanded, continued in spirit through the actions of surviving paladins who refused to abandon their calling. The example Uther had set, of courage and compassion, of faith and justice, remained a beacon for all who followed in his footsteps. The immediate aftermath of Uther's death was a time of profound darkness for the remaining paladins. Their leader was gone, their order dissolved, and their homeland overrun by undead. Many questioned whether the light had abandoned them, whether their faith had been misplaced. The despair was so deep that some considered abandoning their calling entirely. But the memory of Uther would not let them give up. They remembered his teachings, his unwavering commitment to the light, even in the face of impossible odds. If he had maintained his faith while watching his student become a monster, while facing death at that student's hands, then surely they could maintain theirs. His example became their strength, his words their guidance. The scattered survivors began to organize, forming cells of resistance throughout the fallen kingdoms. They could not defeat the Scourge in open battle, but they could rescue survivors, protect refugees, and strike at the undead when opportunity presented itself. This guerrilla warfare kept the flame of hope alive during the darkest days of the Third War. Some paladins joined forces with other survivors to form the Argent Dawn. This organization brought together warriors from multiple faiths and traditions, united by their opposition to the Scourge. Though it was not the Silver Hand, the Dawn carried forward many of Uther's teachings and principles. The founding of the Argent Dawn represented a new approach to fighting the undead menace. Unlike the Silver Hand, which had been exclusively composed of paladins from the Church of the Holy Light, the Dawn welcomed anyone who opposed the Scourge. Priests and mages, warriors and rogues, even former members of the Horde who had broken free of their demonic masters found a place in its ranks. This inclusivity was controversial at first. Some of Uther's surviving paladins argued that the order should remain pure, that mixing with those outside the Light's traditions would dilute their power. But others pointed to Uther's own example, his willingness to work with the diverse members of the Alliance, his respect for all who fought for good, regardless of their methods. The latter view prevailed. The Argent Dawn established bases throughout the eastern Plague Lands, reclaiming territory from the Scourge inch by bloody inch. They developed new techniques for fighting the undead, combining holy magic with conventional warfare in ways that Uther himself might have appreciated. Their efforts saved thousands of lives and created safe havens where survivors could find shelter and hope. The organization also took on the work of studying the plague and the scourge, seeking to understand their enemies so they could fight them more effectively. Researchers in Argent Dawn camps analyzed plague samples, studied captured undead, and compiled records of scourge movements and tactics. This knowledge was shared freely with anyone who could use it, another departure from the secretive traditions of the old Silver Hand. Others traveled south, seeking to rebuild their strength before returning to fight. They established connections with paladins in Stormwind and Ironforge, sharing their experiences and their determination. The network they created would eventually form the foundation for the Silver Hand's formal reconstitution. In the years following the Third War, the Tomb of Uther became a place of pilgrimage for followers of the light. Despite its location in the heart of the Plague Lands, surrounded by undead and corruption, the faithful made the dangerous journey to pay their respects. They believed that even in death, the Lightbringer's presence could offer comfort and strength. The tomb was guarded by High Priest Theldonis, a dedicated servant of the light who had sworn to protect Uther's resting place. He maintained the wards that kept the undead at bay, welcomed pilgrims who arrived, seeking solace, and preserved the memory of what Uther had stood for. His devotion was a testament to the impact the first paladin had made on those who knew him. A statue was erected in Uther's honor at the Cathedral of Light in Stormwind City. The sculpture depicted the Lightbringer in his prime, clad in armor and wielding his legendary hammer, his face set in an expression of determined compassion. Visitors to the cathedral would pause before the statue, offering prayers and reflecting on the virtues it represented. The statue became more than just a memorial. It served as a gathering point for paladins from across the Alliance, a place where they could connect with the traditions that Uther had established. Young knights would come to be blessed before their first battles, touching the base of the statue as they asked for the Lightbringer's guidance. Veterans would return after difficult missions, kneeling in silent communion with the memory of their order's founder. The inscription at the statue's base repeated the words from Uther's tomb. His light is the light of all humanity, and so long as we honor his example, it shall never fade. These words became a kind of prayer for the faithful, spoken in moments of doubt or danger. They reminded believers that they were part of something larger than themselves, connected to a tradition that stretched back to the very founding of the Paladin order. Pilgrims from distant lands made journeys to see the statue, some traveling for weeks or months to reach Stormwind. They brought offerings of flowers and candles, leaving them at the statue's feet until the cathedral's priests had to clear them away to make room for more. Some claimed to experience visions while praying before the statue, moments of clarity or comfort that they attributed to Uther's ongoing spiritual presence. The artists who created the statue had worked from descriptions provided by those who had known Uther personally. They had captured not just his physical appearance, but something of his character, the blend of strength and gentleness that had made him unique. Looking at the statue, one could almost imagine hearing his voice, the calm tone he used when counseling the troubled, the fierce cry he raised when leading charges against the enemy. The Knights of the Silver Hand were eventually reformed, though under different leadership and in changed circumstances. The order that Uther had helped found continued to train paladins and defend the innocent, carrying on the traditions established in Alonce's chapel so many years before. New generations of warriors learned Uther's story, drawing inspiration from his example. The hammer that Uther had wielded in battle became a relic of immense importance. Known as the Hammer of the Lightbringer, it was preserved by faithful followers and eventually passed to those deemed worthy of carrying it. The weapon served as a tangible connection to Uther's legacy, reminder that his strength and faith could still empower those who fought for the light. Uther's influence extended beyond the Silver Hand to shape the broader practice of the Paladin calling. The techniques he had developed, the teachings he had passed on, became standard training for Paladins throughout the Alliance. His emphasis on combining martial prowess with spiritual devotion, on serving people in their everyday needs, as well as defending them in battle, remained central to what it meant to be a paladin. The tragic nature of Uther's death, murdered by his own student, added a dimension of martyrdom to his legacy. He became a symbol not just of the paladin ideal, but of the costs of standing for principle in a fallen world. His story was told as both inspiration and warning, reminding listeners that even the greatest heroes could be betrayed by those they loved. The relationship between Uther and Arthas fascinated scholars and storytellers for generations. They analyzed every aspect of their bond, searching for the moment when things went wrong, for the choice that set them on the path to tragedy. Some blamed Arthas's inherent flaws, others blamed the manipulation of the Burning Legion. Still others wondered if Uther could have done something differently, if a word or action might have prevented the catastrophe. Historians wrote lengthy treatises, examining the relationship from every angle. They pored over accounts from those who had witnessed their interactions, looking for signs that might have predicted the eventual falling out. Some pointed to Arthas's childhood temperament, his tendency toward impatience, and his difficulty with failure. Others focused on the pressures of royal expectation, the weight of knowing that an entire kingdom would one day rest on young shoulders. The theological debates were equally intense. Scholars of the light questioned whether Uther had been right to walk away from Stratholme. The standard teaching held that innocent life must always be protected, that slaughter was never acceptable, no matter the circumstances. But some argued that the people of Stratholme were no longer innocent once the plague had taken hold, that their transformation into undead was as certain as the rising of the sun. By this logic, killing them before their change was an act of mercy rather than murder. These debates found no resolution because there was no resolution to be found. The situation at Stratholme had been unprecedented, a horror that defied the categories of normal moral reasoning. Whatever choice was made would have terrible consequences. Arthas had chosen one path, Uther another, and both had been destroyed by the outcome. Plays and songs were written about the tragedy, each interpretation emphasizing different aspects of the story. Some portrayed Uther as a wise mentor betrayed by a weak-willed student. Others depicted Arthas as a hero corrupted by forces beyond his control, with Uther as the rigid authority who failed to understand. The most nuanced versions acknowledged that both men had been right and wrong in their own ways, that the tragedy lay in the impossibility of the situation rather than the failings of any individual. Children grew up hearing the story of Uther and Arthas as a cautionary tale. The moral varied depending on who told it. Some emphasized the importance of following rules and respecting authority. Others focused on the dangers of certainty, the need to remain open to doubt, even when one believes oneself to be right. Still others drew lessons about love and attachment, the pain that comes when those we care for most betray us. No definitive answer was ever found. The transformation of Arthas from promising prince to Death Knight seemed to involve multiple factors, any one of which might have been countered if circumstances had been different. What was certain was that Uther had done his best, had tried with all his strength and wisdom to guide his student toward the light. The failure was not his alone to bear. The memory of Stratholme haunted the survivors in different ways. Jaina Proudmoore, who had walked away with Uther, struggled with guilt over her decision not to help Arthas. She wondered if staying might have made a difference, if she could have talked him down from his madness. The experience shaped her leadership style, making her more cautious about military action and more willing to seek diplomatic solutions. For the citizens of Lordaeron who survived the Third War, Uther represented what they had lost. He embodied the kingdom at its best, a time of prosperity and honor that seemed almost mythical compared to the horror of the scourge. Invoking his name was a way of connecting with that lost past, of affirming that the values he stood for still mattered. The Argent Dawn, an organization founded to fight the scourge, drew heavily on Uther's legacy. Many of its members had been Silver Hand paladins, and they carried his teachings with them into their new struggle. The Dawn's eventual transformation into the Argent Crusade continued this tradition, creating an institution that explicitly honored what Uther had built. The Argent Crusade's most significant achievement came during the war against the Lich King in Northrend. Under the leadership of Tirion Fordring, one of the original 5 paladins who had been consecrated alongside Uther, the crusade led the assault on Icecrown Citadel itself. This campaign brought together forces from both the Alliance and the Horde, united against the common threat of the Scourge. The parallels to Uther's own life were impossible to ignore. Another paladin facing another Death Knight, another confrontation between light and darkness on the frozen wastes. Tirion had known Uther well, had trained beside him and fought beside him, had mourned his death and sworn to honor his memory. Now he was given the chance to complete what Uther had begun, to finally defeat the evil that had claimed his friend. The battle atop Icecrown Citadel was the climax of years of struggle. Heroes from across Azeroth fought their way through layer after layer of undead defenses, finally reaching the frozen throne where the Lich King waited. The final confrontation was brutal and nearly hopeless, with the Lich King demonstrating power that seemed impossible to overcome. At the crucial moment, Tirion Fordring broke free from the ice that had imprisoned him and shattered Frostmourne with the Ashbringer. The act released the souls that the rune blade had consumed over the years, including the fragment of Uther's soul that had been trapped within. This moment represented a kind of liberation for Uther, freeing a part of him that had been bound to darkness since his death. The Lich King was defeated, his crown taken by Bolvar Fordragon, who would serve as the new jailer of the damned. The Scourge, though not destroyed, was contained, its threat reduced to something manageable. The war that had begun with the plague in Lordaeron was finally, after years of suffering and death, brought to a close. The story of Uther the Lightbringer became one of the defining narratives of human civilization in Azeroth. It was told to children as a bedtime story, taught in schools as history, and referenced in sermons as theology. His life and death embodied themes of courage, sacrifice, faith, and the tragic consequences of good intentions gone wrong. Perhaps most significantly, Uther's legacy provided hope. In the darkest times, when it seemed that evil would triumph and all would be lost, people remembered the first paladin. They remembered that he had faced darkness and refused to yield, that he had died still believing in the light. If he could hold to his principles in the face of such horror, then perhaps they could too. The physical tomb in the western Plaguelands was eventually cleansed of much of its surrounding corruption. The Argent Crusade established a stronger presence in the region, pushing back the undead and reclaiming territory that had been lost for years. The pilgrimage to Uther's resting place became somewhat less dangerous, though still meaningful for those who undertook it. But even as his mortal legacy flourished, Uther's story was far from over. Death, it turned out, was not the end but merely a transition. The Shadowlands awaited, realms beyond the Veil where souls continued to exist in ways the living could barely comprehend. And Uther's soul, damaged by Frostmourne's curse, faced trials that would make even the Scourge seem simple by comparison. When Uther died, his soul did not simply drift away into peaceful rest. Frostmourne, the cursed blade that killed him, had done something terrible to his very essence. The rune blade was designed to consume souls, to trap them within its darkness for the Lich King's use. When it struck Uther, it tore a piece of his soul away, casting it into the maw the darkest corner of the Shadowlands, reserved for the most irredeemable beings. What remained of Uther's soul was drawn to Bastion, one of the realms of the Shadowlands. Bastion was the domain of the Kyrian, winged beings who served as guides for souls entering the afterlife. They were charged with ferrying the dead to their appropriate destinations, a sacred duty that required absolute devotion and the surrender of mortal attachments. The realm of Bastion was unlike anything the living could imagine. Endless fields of golden grass stretched beneath a sky of eternal twilight, lit by stars that never moved and a moon that never changed. Crystalline spires rose from the landscape, structures of pure light that served as temples and training grounds for the Kyrian. The air itself seemed to hum with purpose, each breath carrying the sense of cosmic significance. The Kyrian themselves were beings of ethereal beauty. They appeared as winged humanoids, their forms radiating soft blue light, their faces serene and ageless. They moved with grace that no mortal could match, their wings carrying them effortlessly through the eternal skies. Their society was ordered and purposeful, each member knowing exactly their role in the great work of guiding souls. New arrivals to Bastion were called aspirants. They underwent a process of training and purification designed to prepare them for service as Kyrian. This process required the release of mortal memories, the letting go of all attachments to the life that had ended. The reasoning was simple. A guide who was still bound by mortal concerns could not serve impartially, could not help every soul equally. Freedom from the past was necessary for service in the present. Most souls who came to Bastion accepted this requirement. Their mortal lives had been completed, their stories finished. Releasing those memories was painful, but ultimately liberating, allowing them to embrace their new purpose without the weight of old regrets. The system had worked for countless millennia, producing generation after generation of devoted Kyrian. The Kyrian who came for Uther was named Davos, a paragon of loyalty who had served the Archon for millennia. She was one of the most respected members of the Kyrian hierarchy, known for her unwavering commitment to duty and her gentle manner with newly arrived souls. When she found Uther, she immediately recognized that something was wrong. Davos had collected countless souls over her long existence, guiding them from death to their appropriate places in the Shadowlands. She had seen souls damaged by violence, scarred by trauma, twisted by evil deeds. Each presented its own challenges, but her training and experience had always proven sufficient to address them. This soul was different. The Kyrian process of soul retrieval was normally a gentle one. The soul of the deceased would be drawn naturally toward its destined realm, and the Kyrian's role was merely to guide and assist this transition. But Uther's soul was not following the normal patterns. It was fractured, incomplete, radiating pain that even Davos could feel from a distance. When she approached more closely, the nature of the damage became clear. A piece of Uther's soul was simply missing, torn away by some terrible force and cast into darkness. What remained was wounded in ways that defied the normal categories of spiritual injury. This was not the damage caused by a violent death or a lifetime of sin. This was something new, something that should not exist. Davos gathered Uther's fractured spirit with unusual care, shielding it from further harm as she carried it toward Bastion. During the journey, she examined the wound more closely, trying to understand its origin. The dark energy that leaked from the tear was familiar somehow, connected to something vast and terrible that she could not quite identify. The wound left by Frostmourne was unlike anything Davos had ever seen. It was not a physical injury, but a spiritual one, a scar on Uther's very essence that refused to heal. Dark energy leaked from the wound, corruption from the maw that had no place in the Cretan realm of Bastion. Davos understood that this required immediate attention. She brought her concerns to the Archon, the supreme leader of Bastion and the Kyrian. The Archon was an ancient and powerful being, connected to the cosmic forces that governed the Shadowlands. Davos expected that such an unusual case would warrant special consideration, perhaps an exception to the normal processes that govern souls in Bastion. The Archon, however, was unmoved. She acknowledged the wound, but decreed that Uther should undergo the standard Kyrian process, regardless. Souls in Bastion were required to release their mortal memories, to shed their attachments to their former lives, so they could become pure vessels for their eternal duties. This process, called ascension, was meant to free souls from the pain of their past. Davos was troubled by this decision. She had seen the corruption in Uther's wound, had sensed its connection to something terrible. Simply ignoring it and proceeding with standard protocols seemed dangerous, perhaps even negligent. But the Archon's word was law in Bastion, and Davos's loyalty to that law had never wavered, until now. Instead of following the Archon's decree, Davos made a fateful choice. She initiated Uther's ascension herself, but she did not erase his memories as was customary. She allowed him to retain his mortal experiences, his knowledge of Arthas and Frostmourne, and the events that had led to his death. This was a profound violation of Kyrian protocol, undertaken out of conviction that the standard approach was insufficient. Uther became an ascended Kyrian, but one unlike any other in Bastion's history. He retained his identity, his memories, and his emotions in ways that other ascended did not. He also retained his wound, the scar from Frostmourne that continued to fester in his soul. Neither the light nor the powers of Bastion could fully heal what the rune blade had done. The memories that Uther kept were a double-edged sword. They allowed him to remain himself, to preserve the personality and principles that had defined his mortal life. But they also kept his pain alive, his grief over Arthas's fall, and his anger at the injustice of his death. These emotions, which Kyrian were supposed to release, festered within him. Davos watched Uther struggle with his condition and became increasingly convinced that the Archon had been wrong. The wound from Frostmourne was not just a personal tragedy, but a warning about something larger. If a weapon could damage souls in this way, if the Maw's corruption could reach into Bastion itself, then the cosmic order was threatened. Something had to be done. The two began to talk, sharing their doubts about the system they served. Davos explained the history of the Kyrian, their purpose and their laws, while questioning whether those laws remained appropriate for the challenges they faced. Uther shared his mortal experiences, his memories of the Scourge and its horrors, and his belief that sometimes rules had to be broken to serve a higher good. These conversations took place over what might have been years in mortal time, though time in the Shadowlands moved differently. Davos and Uther walked the paths of Bastion together, discussing philosophy and morality, while the pristine realm continued its eternal work around them. Their bond deepened as they found in each other kindred spirits, both devoted to service, yet both troubled by doubts. Davos shared stories of her own long service, the countless souls she had guided to their final rest. She spoke of the peace she had once found in duty, the certainty that had sustained her through millennia. But she also spoke of the questions that had begun to trouble her, the nagging sense that something fundamental had gone wrong with the system she served. Uther, in turn, shared the details of his mortal life in ways he had never done with anyone. He spoke of his relationship with Faol, of the founding of the Silver Hand, of the pride he had felt in his order and his students. He spoke of Arthas, of the promise the young prince had shown, and the horror of watching that promise curdle into something monstrous. He wept, something that Kyrian were not supposed to do, and Davos did not judge him. The wound from Frostmourne ached constantly, a reminder of what had been done to him. It throbbed with dark energy when Uther thought about Arthas, pulsed with rage when he remembered his death. Davos studied the wound carefully, trying to understand its nature. What she found disturbed her deeply. The energy from the wound was connected to something vast and terrible, a power that seemed to reach out from the darkest corners of the Shadowlands. Davos recognized this energy as coming from the Maw, the prison realm where only the most irredeemable souls were sent. But how had the Maw's corruption reached into the mortal world? How had it come to infect a rune blade that had been created by the Burning Legion? These questions had no easy answers, but they convinced Davos that the threat was greater than anyone in Bastion understood. The Archon's dismissal of her concerns now seemed not just negligent, but potentially catastrophic. If the Maw was reaching out to corrupt the living world, then the entire cosmic order might be at risk. Their conversations led them to a decision that would have far-reaching consequences. When Arthas was finally defeated atop Icecrown Citadel, his soul was released from Frostmourne and began its journey to the Shadowlands. According to Kyrian law, he should have been ferried to the Arbiter, the impartial judge who assigned souls to their appropriate realms, but Davos and Uther intercepted him. They seized Arthas's soul before it could reach the Arbiter and carried it directly to the Maw, the realm of eternal torment. No trial, no judgment, no possibility of redemption, just immediate condemnation to the worst fate that the Shadowlands could offer. For Uther, this act felt like justice. Arthas had murdered him, had murdered millions, had betrayed everything that was good and holy. He deserved no mercy, no fair hearing, no chance to escape punishment. The system that would give him anything other than immediate damnation was flawed and needed to be circumvented. For Davos, the act confirmed her growing belief that the Kyrian system was broken. If souls like Arthas could slip through to anything other than the Maw, if the Arbiter might show leniency to such monsters, then the judgment process itself was inadequate. More direct action was needed to ensure that justice was done. What neither of them knew was that by bypassing the Arbiter, they were contributing to a much larger problem. The Maw was ruled by a being called the Jailer, an ancient evil who had been imprisoned there for cosmic crimes. The Jailer was working to break free of his prison, and every soul that entered the Maw without proper judgment added to his power. Their act of vengeance, intended to punish the guilty, inadvertently strengthened one of the greatest threats the Shadowlands had ever known. The consequences of Uther and Devos's actions extended far beyond the fate of Arthas. Their circumvention of cosmic law created ripples that disturbed the balance of the Shadowlands itself. More immediately, it set Devos on a path that would lead to open rebellion against everything she had once served. The act of casting Arthas into the maw without judgment sent shockwaves through the machinery of the Shadowlands. The Arbiter, who was supposed to receive and judge all souls, registered the anomaly but could not immediately identify its source. Other souls whose fates were connected to Arthas in some way experienced disruptions in their own journeys. The careful balance that had governed death for eons was disturbed. For Devos, the act confirmed everything she had come to suspect about the Kyrian system. If they could circumvent the Arbiter to ensure justice for a soul like Arthas, then the system itself was inadequate. What other souls had been misassigned? What other monsters had received lenient treatment because the Arbiter's judgment was too mechanical, too removed from the reality of mortal experience? These questions gnawed at Devos as she returned to her duties. She continued to collect souls and guide them to Bastion, but each case now seemed to highlight flaws in the system. A soul that had committed terrible crimes but showed remorse was sent to Revendreth for redemption. Did it deserve that chance? A soul that had lived virtuously but harbored secret doubts was assigned to Bastion. Would the erasure of those doubts destroy who they really were? The doubts became impossible to ignore. Devos began to speak with others who shared her concerns, Kyrian who had witnessed their own troubling cases, aspirants who struggled to release memories they felt defined them. A community of the questioning formed, meeting in quiet corners of Bastion to discuss what they had seen and what it meant. Devos became the leader of the Forsworn, a faction of Kyrian who rejected the Archon's authority and the requirement to shed mortal memories. She argued that the system was corrupt, that it served powers who had lost touch with justice and compassion. Her followers included both Kyrian, who doubted the traditional ways, and mortals who had arrived in Bastion and refused to surrender their identities. Uther joined the Forsworn, though his role was complicated. He shared Devos's concerns about the system, but was not entirely comfortable with open warfare against Bastion's legitimate authorities. His wounds, both the original scar from Frostmourne and the newer wounds to his conscience, made it difficult for him to think clearly about right and wrong. The Forsworn attacked sacred sites throughout Bastion, including the Temple of Courage. Uther participated in these assaults, using his skills as a warrior to break through defenses and his knowledge as a former paladin to target the vulnerable points in Kyrian formations. He told himself that this was necessary, that the ends justified the means, but the words rang hollow even in his own mind. The assaults allowed other enemies some access to Bastion. Forces from Maldraxxus, another realm of the Shadowlands, exploited the breaches created by the Forsworn to launch their own attacks. The Temple of Courage was overrun, its defenders slaughtered or scattered. What had begun as a philosophical rebellion was becoming a catastrophic civil war. When mortal heroes from Azeroth arrived in the Shadowlands, they encountered a realm in chaos. The Forsworn were one of many threats destabilizing Bastion, their attacks disrupting the essential work of ferrying souls to their destinations. The heroes were drawn into the conflict, eventually confronting Uther himself. The encounter forced Uther to examine what he had become. He saw himself through mortal eyes, a legendary hero who had apparently turned against his principles. The comparison between the Uther they had heard about in stories and the Uther they found serving the Forsworn was jarring and painful. Through conversation and confrontation, Uther began to understand the full scope of what had happened. He learned that Devos had been manipulated, that her rebellion served the interests of the jailer rather than any genuine cause of justice. He discovered that the maw he had consigned Arthas to was the domain of an evil as great as any the living world had known. The realization was devastating. Uther had thought he was serving justice, punishing a monster who deserved no mercy. Instead, he had been a pawn in a cosmic game, his righteous anger exploited by forces that cared nothing for justice or redemption. Everything he had done since arriving in Bastion had been tainted by this manipulation. Devos herself eventually fell, defeated by those who sought to restore order to Bastion. Her death left the Forsworn leaderless and threw Uther's own position into question. He had followed her out of conviction, but that conviction had been based on incomplete understanding. What was he supposed to do now? The answer came through repentance. Uther surrendered himself to the Kyrian authorities, offering to accept whatever punishment they deemed appropriate for his crimes. He did not try to excuse his actions or minimize his role in the rebellion. He simply acknowledged that he had been wrong and expressed willingness to make amends. The Kyrian, to their credit, did not respond with immediate condemnation. They recognized that Uther's situation was unique, that the wound from Frostmourne had contributed to his vulnerability, and that Devos's manipulation had exploited his genuine concerns. Rather than punishment, they offered treatment. Uther was taken to the Temple of Wisdom, where the Paragon of Wisdom agreed to study his condition. The wound from Frostmourne was examined with methods unavailable to mortal healers, its nature and extent mapped in detail. The goal was not just to understand what had happened to Uther, but to learn how to prevent such wounds in the future. The process was painful but necessary. Uther had to confront not just his recent actions, but his entire history, the choices that had led him to where he was. He had to examine his relationship with Arthas, acknowledging both the love he had felt and the ways that love had contributed to his later rage. He had to consider whether his commitment to justice had sometimes crossed the line into vengeance. The examination began with his earliest memories, his time at Northshire Abbey and his training under Archbishop Faol. These memories were generally positive, filled with the glow of youth and the excitement of discovering his calling. But even here, the Paragon found traces of the pride that had later caused problems, the certainty that he was special, chosen, destined for greatness. From there, they moved to his experiences in the wars, the battles he had fought, and the lives he had taken. Uther had always believed that his violence was justified, sanctioned by the light, and necessary for the protection of the innocent. But examining those experiences from the perspective of eternity, he saw shades of gray where he had once seen only black and white. Some deaths had been necessary. Others might have been avoided with more patience, more wisdom, more compassion. The examination of his relationship with Arthas was the most painful part of the process. Uther had to acknowledge how much of his identity had been bound up in his role as this prince's mentor. He had seen Arthas as a continuation of himself, a legacy that would carry his values forward after his death. When Arthas had fallen, a part of Uther had died with him, and another part had been consumed by rage. The Paragon helped him see that this investment had been too great, that Uther had placed burdens on Arthas that no young man should have to bear. The prince had been expected to be perfect, to never fail, to fulfill all the hopes that his mentor had placed in him. When those expectations proved impossible to meet, the resulting disappointment had been devastating for both of them. Through this examination, Uther began to find a measure of peace. He could not undo what had happened, could not bring back those who had died in the Forsworn rebellion, or retrieve Arthas's soul from the maw. But he could learn from his mistakes, could grow into someone who would make better choices in the future. The Paragon of Wisdom became a teacher and companion during this process. Their conversations ranged across topics, both cosmic and personal, exploring the nature of justice, the meaning of redemption, and the possibility of healing even the most terrible wounds. Uther found in these discussions something he had not experienced since his days with Archbishop Faol: genuine mentorship from someone wiser than himself. The fragment of his soul that had been torn away by Frostmourne remained lost, trapped in the maw, or destroyed entirely. Uther would never be whole in the way he had been before his death, but he came to accept this limitation, understanding that wholeness was not necessary for meaning. He could still serve, still contribute, still grow, even in his diminished state. As the larger conflicts in the Shadowlands unfolded, Uther found ways to help without returning to violence. He offered counsel to other Kyrian who struggled with their duties, sharing the lessons he had learned about the dangers of certainty and the importance of questioning. He welcomed newly arrived souls, providing comfort and guidance as they adjusted to their afterlife. In time, Uther found something he had not expected: forgiveness, not from others, though that came as well, but from himself. He accepted that he had failed, that his failure had caused harm, and that this failure did not erase everything good he had done in his life and afterlife. He was still Uther the Lightbringer, even if the light he bore was different now. The last mortal visitors to speak with Uther found him sitting with the Paragon of Wisdom at the top of the temple. He was at peace, or something close to it, his expression calm, and his presence no longer tinged with the anger that had marked his time with the Forsworn. He spoke of his hopes for the future, for Bastion, and for the souls who would continue to arrive there seeking rest. He also spoke of Arthas, finally able to discuss his former student without rage or bitterness, acknowledged that Arthas had done terrible things, that punishment was appropriate for those things. But he also remembered the young man he had trained, the potential that had been corrupted, the tragedy of a soul lost to darkness. He hoped, in some corner of his heart, that even Arthas might eventually find redemption. The question of Arthas's fate remained one that troubled many in the Shadowlands. Some believed that no punishment could be sufficient for his crimes, that eternal torment in the maw was exactly what he deserved. Others argued that the corruption had not been entirely his choice, that the Lich King's influence had twisted a soul that might otherwise have remained good. The debate echoed the one that had raged in Azeroth for years, with no more resolution in death than there had been in life. For Uther, the answer had become personal rather than philosophical. He had loved Arthas once, had seen in him the future of everything he had built. That love had turned to rage when Arthas fell, and the rage had led Uther to actions he now regretted. The cycle of anger and vengeance had consumed them both, destroying any hope of the relationship they had once shared. Breaking that cycle was the work of Uther's afterlife. He learned to hold his anger without being controlled by it, to acknowledge his pain without letting it define him. He practiced forgiveness, not because Arthas deserved it, but because Uther needed to be free of the burden. The process was slow and difficult, but it was the path toward the peace he sought. The visitors from Azeroth brought news of the mortal world, stories of events that Uther would never see. He learned of new threats and new heroes, of wars won and lost, of the continuing struggle between light and darkness. Each report reminded him that the cause he had served in life continued in his absence, that the values he had championed still mattered. Whether such hope was justified, the future would have to reveal. What was certain was that Uther's own redemption was underway, a process that might take eons in the timeless realm of the Shadowlands, but that had definitively begun. The first paladin was learning new lessons, growing in ways he never had in life, becoming something both more and less than the hero he had been. As we reach the end of our journey through Uther's story, let us pause to reflect on the significance of this remarkable life. From his early days in Lordaeron to his ongoing existence in the Shadowlands, Uther the Lightbringer has embodied the highest ideals and deepest struggles of those who seek to serve the light. He was the first paladin, the prototype for all who would follow, and in that role he established standards that have endured for generations. His combination of martial prowess and spiritual devotion, of strength and compassion, created a template that paladins throughout Azeroth still strive to emulate. Every paladin who raises their hammer in defense of the innocent honors the legacy that Uther began. Yet Uther's story is not simply one of triumph. It is also a story of failure, of loss, of choices made in impossible circumstances. He trained the student who would become the Lich King's greatest champion. He walked away from Stratholme when perhaps he should have stayed. He let vengeance consume him in the afterlife when he should have sought wisdom. These failures do not diminish his greatness. They make it human. The question of what Uther could have done differently at Stratholme has never been satisfactorily answered. Perhaps no action could have prevented Arthas's fall. The prince was already under the influence of forces beyond mortal comprehension, his fate shaped by demonic manipulation, and the curse that would eventually claim him entirely. Even if Uther had stayed, had participated in the culling alongside his student, would the outcome have been different? Some argue that by refusing to participate, Uther preserved the moral authority of the light. He demonstrated that there are lines that should never be crossed, no matter how compelling the justification. His refusal became a marker, a standard by which future paladins could measure their own choices. When they faced impossible situations, they could ask themselves what Uther would have done, and the answer was clear. He would have stood for principle even at the cost of everything else. Others argue that his refusal was a failure of compassion. Arthas was alone at Stratholme, surrounded by soldiers who would follow orders but offer no counsel. If Uther had stayed, even to argue against the culling, he might have been a voice of reason in the chaos. His presence might have slowed Arthas down, given him time to reconsider, created an opportunity for a different choice. By leaving, Uther abandoned his student at the moment when he needed guidance most. The truth is probably somewhere between these positions, as truth often is. Uther made the best choice he could with the information he had, under pressure that no one should have to face. His choice had consequences, some intended and some not. The same would have been true of any other choice he might have made. He was not a god or a prophet, but a man, doing his best in a situation that had no good options. The tragedy of Uther and Arthas resonates because it reflects truths we all know. We have all loved people who disappointed us, trusted those who betrayed us, hoped for those who fell. We have all faced moments when the right choice was unclear, when every path seemed to lead to some form of harm. Uther's story tells us that even the greatest heroes face such moments, and that facing them does not make us failures. The light that Uther served was never a simple force for good. It demanded sacrifice, required difficult choices, and did not guarantee victory or happiness. Uther followed the light knowing that it might lead him to suffering, and suffering indeed found him. But he also found meaning, purpose, and eventually redemption, gifts that the light offers to all who serve it faithfully. His legacy in Azeroth continues to shape the present. The Knights of the Silver Hand have been reformed multiple times since their dissolution at Stratholme, each iteration drawing on the traditions and teachings that Uther helped establish. Paladins across the world invoke his name in their prayers, asking for his guidance and blessing. His tomb in the Western Plaguelands remains a pilgrimage site, proof that even death cannot end a hero's influence. The training methods that Uther developed have been codified and passed down through generations of paladins. New recruits learn the same combination of meditation and combat that Uther himself learned under Archbishop Faol. They study the same sacred texts, practice the same prayers, and strive to embody the same virtues. In this way, Uther's influence extends not just to those who knew him, but to all who have followed in his footsteps. The stories told about Uther have taken on mythical proportions over the years. Some depict him as a figure of pure light, incapable of doubt or error. Others focus on his human frailties, his struggles with anger and grief. The historical Uther exists somewhere between these extremes, a man who was exceptional but not perfect, who achieved great things but also made mistakes. This complexity makes him a more compelling figure than a simple saint would be. Monuments to Uther can be found throughout the Alliance territories. Beyond the famous statue in Stormwind, smaller shrines exist in cities and villages across the continent. Travelers stop at these shrines to offer prayers for safety and guidance, believing that Uther's spirit watches over all who serve the light. During times of crisis, crowds gather at these sites, seeking comfort in the memory of one who faced darkness and endured. The armor and weapons that Uther wore and wielded have become holy relics. Some pieces remain in the possession of the Silver Hand, brought out for important ceremonies and blessed by senior paladins. Others have been scattered across the world, discovered by adventurers, and brought back to the faithful. Each piece is treated with reverence, a tangible connection to the first paladin that seems to radiate the light's power. The annual commemorations of Uther's death have become major events in the paladin calendar. On the anniversary of his fall at Andorhal, paladins across the Alliance gather for ceremonies of remembrance. They recite his teachings, share stories of his deeds, and renew their vows to serve the light as he did. These gatherings strengthen the bonds between paladins and remind them of the tradition they carry forward. Young paladins are often brought to these ceremonies as part of their training. They hear first-hand accounts from veterans who may have known Uther personally, or who knew those who did. The stories are passed down from generation to generation, each telling adding new details and insights. In this way, Uther remains alive in the collective memory of the Order, his presence felt even by those born long after his death. The theological implications of Uther's story continue to be debated by scholars of the light. His fall to vengeance in the Shadowlands raises questions about the nature of virtue and the persistence of mortal flaws beyond death. His eventual redemption suggests that even the most serious moral failures can be overcome through sincere effort. These lessons inform the pastoral work of priests and paladins throughout the Alliance. The relationship between the light as practiced in Azeroth and the cosmic forces of the Shadowlands remains mysterious. Uther's journey suggests that the light recognized in mortal life is connected to something larger, a universal principle that operates across all realms of existence. This connection gives hope to the faithful, suggesting that their service in life will be recognized and rewarded in the existence that follows. In the Shadowlands, Uther's story continues to unfold. He has found a measure of peace, though the wounds from Frostmourne may never fully heal. He has learned lessons that were unavailable to him in life, growing in wisdom, if not in power. And he has accepted his place in the cosmic order, serving the purposes of the light, even in a realm beyond mortality. Now let the tale of Uther the Lightbringer guide you toward peaceful rest. Imagine the golden light that he channeled, the warm radiance that healed wounds and lifted spirits. Let that light fill your mind, pushing away the worries and stresses of the day. Feel it spreading through your body, relaxing muscles and calming nerves. The light that Uther served is not confined to Azeroth or to any single realm. It is a universal force, present in all places and all times, available to all who open themselves to its warmth. You can feel it now if you allow yourself, a gentle presence that asks nothing of you except that you accept its comfort. It does not judge your failings or demand your perfection. It simply is like the sun rising each morning, offering its gifts to all who stand beneath it. Think of the chapel at Alonsus in Stratholme, where the first paladins were consecrated. Though the city itself was lost to darkness, the memory of what happened there endures. 5 men knelt before the light and rose transformed, dedicated to a cause that would outlast their mortal lives. The light that filled that chapel fills the universe still, unchanged by the passing of centuries or the falling of heroes. Think of the tomb in the western Plague Lands, where pilgrims gather to honor Uther's memory. Even in the midst of corruption and death, the light maintains a presence there, a sanctuary where the faithful can find peace. The wards that protect the tomb are not just magical barriers, but manifestations of the light's enduring power, proof that darkness cannot ultimately triumph. Think of Bastion, where Uther now dwells, where souls find rest after their mortal struggles have ended. The light takes different forms in different realms, but its essence remains the same. It offers guidance to the lost, healing to the wounded, and hope to the despairing. Uther has found these gifts in his afterlife, and they are available to you as well in this life and beyond. Picture Uther as he was in his prime, standing tall in gleaming armor, his hammer resting at his side. See the kindness in his eyes, the determination in his stance, the faith that radiated from his very being. He stands watch, as he always did, protecting those who need protection, guiding those who seek guidance. The enemies he faced were terrible, but he did not let terror control him. The choices he made were difficult, but he made them with conviction. The losses he suffered were devastating, but he endured them with grace. His example shows us that we too can face our challenges with courage, make our decisions with integrity, and survive our sorrows with dignity. Let your breathing slow, matching the steady rhythm of a heart at peace. Your body grows heavy, sinking into whatever surface supports you. Your thoughts drift like clouds across a peaceful sky, present but undemanding. The world outside recedes, its concerns temporarily released. You are safe now, protected by the light that Uther served. No darkness can reach you here, no shadow can disturb your rest. The same force that gave strength to paladins in battle now gives you the gift of peaceful sleep. Accept this gift gratefully, letting it carry you into the realm of dreams. The story of Uther teaches us that every ending is also a beginning. His death led to his afterlife. His failure with Arthas led to new understanding. His time with the Forsworn led to deeper wisdom. Whatever endings you face in your own life, remember that beginnings await on the other side. May your sleep be deep and restful. May your dreams be touched by the light. And may you wake refreshed, ready to face whatever challenges the new day brings, with the courage and compassion that Uther exemplified. His light is the light of all humanity, and so long as we honor his example, it shall never fade. Rest now. The Lightbringer watches over you. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the complete story of Uther the Lightbringer. If you enjoyed this tale of faith, sacrifice, and redemption, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us create more content exploring the rich lore and history of World of Warcraft. We hope this story has helped carry you toward peaceful sleep. Remember, even in the darkest times, the light endures. Like Uther, we can all find the strength to face our challenges and the wisdom to learn from our failures. May you rest well tonight, and may your dreams be blessed by the light. Until next time, farewell and sleep peacefully.